Tonight's story begins in a distant era, one touched by courage, mystery, and the gentle rhythm of a world long gone. Please subscribe and comment on the story to improve quality and to support your good health and peaceful sleep.
The winter of 1803 was not marked by snow, but by sheer, agonizing ambiguity. I was 29 years old, and as chief draftsman for the Atlantic Cartography Society in Philadelphia, my life was built on lines, crisp, confident lines. A border was a line. A river was a line. The coastline, a beautiful, verifiable, winding line. My world was one of elegant precision. But in that year, accuracy had died, drowned beneath the massive, incomprehensible shadow of the Louisiana Purchase. The news had hit the Republic like a political lightning bolt, thrilling every merchant, farmer, and politician who dreamed of expansion. We had, almost overnight, doubled the size of our country. But for us, the mapmakers, the supposed custodians of truth, it was a nightmare. We had bought 20 million acres of nothing. At least, nothing we could verify. The official French surveys delivered with the treaty were an insult to the profession. They were less maps and more watercolor guesses, vague washes of green and brown that offered little more than the meandering suggestion of the Mississippi and a speculative scratch indicating the direction of the Pacific. Here lie mountains, they seemed to shrug. Beyond that, dragons. We were tasked with preparing the maps for the great Lewis and Clark expedition, yet all we had were political documents that served to confuse more than to clarify. My faith in precision, my entire career, was on the verge of becoming a joke. It was into this atmosphere of frustrated scholarship that it arrived. It was late October. I was alone in my office, the gas lamps casting sharp, analytical light across my drafting table. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of oxidized copper plates and the sweet smell of India ink. A messenger, whose face I barely saw beneath a wide-brimmed, rain-slicked hat, delivered a simple, slender cedar box wrapped in oilcloth. No note, no sender's address, only a wax seal, the intricate impression of a rearing lion with a snapped iron chain pressed into the wood. Curiosity, that professional vice, compelled me. I broke the seal. Inside lay a single, impossibly old document, rolled tight and wrapped not in parchment, but in brittle, sea-worn leather. The leather felt like human skin, smooth yet fibrous, and when I gingerly unrolled it, the paper beneath released a dry, ancient odor, like powdered bone and distant spices. The map, spanning nearly 5 feet when fully extended, was a work of art and a declaration of war against everything I knew. It wasn't titled in French or English, but in Latin, rendered in an elegant, fading script, Terra Incognita Occidentalis, the unknown land of the West. The contrast between this artifact and the government's flimsy documents was horrifying. Where the French had been vague, this map was surgically precise. It didn't just show the rivers, it charted their seasonal depths, their maximum currents, and the precise elevation of the land surrounding them. It marked mineral deposits, specifically large veins of copper and lead with tiny, accurate crosshatches. What seized my attention, however, were not the rivers or the mountains, but the fortifications. Deep in the expanse of the Missouri Territory, in places we presumed were inhabited by only native tribes and buffalo, this map showed a distinct, angular pattern of stone blockhouses and defensive stockades. And they were not French, Spanish, or even British. They were marked with a distinctive, interlocking geometric symbol I had never encountered in any colonial registry. Someone had clearly established a permanent, organized presence in the American heartland years before any American surveyor dared venture there. I dismissed the possibility of forgery instantly. No forger, not even the most skilled hand, would possess this level of topographical and geological knowledge in 1803. The detail on this map predated our current scientific instruments. For the next 4 hours, I worked through the map's cryptic annotations, using every obscure text in the Society's private collection. The marginalia was a mix of Dutch and archaic Spanish, the language of secretive trade, not open diplomacy. I finally stopped at a single, perfect cinnabar ink circle drawn near the Pacific watershed. Beside this circle, a single, horrifying phrase: Regus stultitia, the king's folly. And beneath that, the passage. The blood drained from my face. The passage, the legendary Northwest Passage, the economic holy grail of exploration, the navigable year-round water route linking the Atlantic and the Pacific. The global consensus placed that route in the frozen Arctic, a brutal, impractical avenue. This map, however, situated a viable passage, a continuous system of rivers, lakes, and portages deep within the newly acquired American interior, hundreds of miles to the south of where any rational explorer would search. The King's Folly, a phrase that Professor Alistair Finch, whom I'd met years ago in Boston, had once mentioned. It was a secret designation used by Spanish and Portuguese agents for projects deemed strategically vital but politically too sensitive to ever acknowledge. They had searched and perhaps found the passage, then buried the secret beneath a century of misinformation to deter rival powers. The realization hit me with the force of a battering ram. This was not a mistake. This was a cover-up. A vast, systemic deception perpetrated by a powerful entity, perhaps a forgotten royal faction, perhaps a shadowy trading company, who had been controlling access to the continent's true economic potential, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit it. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I gently rolled the map back into its leather sheath. My life had always been governed by the predictable rhythm of the pendulum clock and the meticulous order of the Society's archive. Now I held the key to an entirely new, deeply dangerous history. What was my duty? As a public servant, I should rush this to the Secretary of State, but Finch's warning, given years earlier on an unrelated matter, echoed in my mind. Elias, when the truth is this powerful, it breeds violent silence. If you threaten a century-old secret, you are not debating history, you are fighting a war. If I presented this map as fact, I would be laughed out of Philadelphia, branded a radical or a liar. But if I kept silent, I would be complicit in concealing a truth that could change the fate of the Republic, giving some unknown foreign power an insidious foothold right in the geographic heart of America. I couldn't stay. The ink on the map was fading, but the truth it contained felt indelible. I was the only man who knew what the French and Spanish were hiding. The lines on this map demanded verification, not debate. I needed to see those angular fortifications with my own eyes. I needed to trace the course of the passage with my own feet. I looked around my familiar office, the neat rows of instruments, the tidy stacks of paper, the comfort of predictable routine. It was the life I had built. I stood up, extinguishing the gas lamps, plunging the room into shadow. I placed the leather-bound map into my deepest satchel, sealing it beneath my personal belongings. The cartographer's tools, the compass, the dividers, the parallel ruler, were going to be exchanged for a rifle, a horse, and the treacherous, unknown vastness of the American West. The year of the fading map would not end with a question. It would end with a journey. The cedar box containing the map was no longer a beautiful artifact. It rested in my satchel, constantly pressing against my hip, a physical manifestation of the impossible burden I now carried. I had only the vague, frantic directions of the faded ink to guide me, and no one to trust. My old life, governed by the predictable rhythm of the pendulum clock and the meticulous order of the Society's archive, felt impossibly distant. I was a man of certainty, forced into the service of uncertainty.
I left Philadelphia under the flimsiest of pretenses, a sudden illness in the family necessitating a hurried trip north. My superiors, men whose highest ambition was a precisely drawn county line, accepted my vague story without question. They simply could not conceive of a truth that spanned continents or outlasted empires. My true destination wasn't a sickly aunt's home, but Boston, and the cramped, history-choked study of Professor Alistair Finch.
Finch was my lighthouse in the intellectual fog. A man of esoteric knowledge, he specialized in the obscure connections between the decline of the Spanish Empire and the rise of Dutch mercantile power in the New World. A man, I remembered, who had once lectured about the use of Jesuit ciphers in colonial documents. If anyone could confirm the map's legitimacy and decipher the final chilling annotations, it was he. The journey by public coach was miserable. A bone-jarring 3-day trek through frozen mud and early winter sleet. I barely slept. Every man who boarded the carriage, every suspicious glance, every sudden jolt of the coach became a potential agent of the powerful, secret faction that had maintained their silence for a century. I clutched the satchel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I finally reached Beacon Hill, the air in Boston was sharper, cleaner, carrying the tang of salt and cold industry. Professor Finch's home was a magnificent, shambling monument to disorganized scholarship, every surface buried beneath stacks of brittle books and clay shards. Finch greeted me with his usual booming formality, his heavy spectacles reflecting the dull amber light of his reading lamp. "Elias, the very picture of anxiety. Tell me, has the great purchase finally broken the nerves of the Atlantic Society?" I didn't answer with a quip. I locked the study door, pulled the map from my satchel, and unrolled the 5-foot expanse across his Persian rug, anchoring the corners with weighty bronze busts of forgotten philosophers. Finch dropped to his knees, utterly silent. He didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, only tracing the lines with a single trembling index finger. His gaze moved from the impossibly detailed topography to the distinctive angular symbols of the non-European fortifications, and finally to the chilling phrase, "The King's Folly, the Passage." When he finally spoke, his voice was reduced to a hoarse whisper, stripped of his professorial arrogance. "My God, Elias, it is genuine, utterly, tragically genuine." He confirmed my fears, then added a layer of dread I hadn't anticipated. "The lion with the snapped chain? That is the mark of the Vanderhoof cartel, not Spanish royalty, but a clandestine organization of former Dutch explorers and Spanish Jesuits who pooled their resources to fund deep interior expeditions. Their goal wasn't conversion or colonization, but absolute control over global trade. If a viable passage existed, their control would have been absolute." Finch hobbled to his central desk and retrieved a heavy tarnished silver locket. It was etched with the same snapped chain lion. "I spent 10 years researching the Vanderhoof theory. They ran a ghost fleet of ships and funded phantom settlements. One of their most brilliant but most eccentric cartographers, a man named Silas Crane, vanished completely in the territory nearly 40 years ago. They said he had gone mad, drawing fantastical places." Finch handed me the locket. It was heavy, strangely warm in my palm. "Silas Crane was never mad, Elias. He simply completed the task. This locket was meant for his wife, never delivered. It holds the first half of a private navigational key unique to the cartel. The scholar's burden is now yours, Elias. This map is not just paper. It is the physical proof of a conspiracy that has kept the American continent strategically hobbled for a century. You must verify those fortresses and confirm that passage before the cartel realizes the map has resurfaced." He was right. My duty to the society, to my quiet life, was over. My duty now was to the idea of the Republic itself.
I need resources, Alistair. I need a cover and I need a weapon. You are a mapmaker, Elias, not a soldier, Finch cautioned, though his eyes showed fierce approval. You must look like a man obsessed with a different kind of profit. For the next 10 days in Boston, I liquidated nearly everything I owned outside my Philadelphia home, using a series of anonymous brokers who asked no questions. I sold an inherited gold watch, 2 valuable first-edition texts, and a small parcel of land in New Jersey. The capital was meager, but it was untraceable. I traded my formal wool coat for thick, durable leather, and purchased supplies with painstaking anonymity. First, the tools of my new trade. A sturdy, used Kentucky long rifle, heavy and intimidating, and a powder horn. I spent 3 full days at a livery stable near the docks, settling on a strong, dappled gray mare, whom I named Meridian, a small tribute to the one clear, true line I still trusted. My cover story was simple but believable in the land frenzy following the purchase. I was an independent surveyor named Elias Crane. I adopted the name of the missing cartographer as a cloak, heading west to purchase land speculation rights near Kentucky. I spoke loudly in taverns about future fortunes and vast tracts of fertile soil, making sure I sounded greedy, simple, and harmless. The tension of preparation was exhilarating, but it was interrupted by the cold dread of reality. I was at the shipyard, haggling over the quality of a heavy canvas tent, when I first saw him. The market was chaos. Sailors, merchants, farmers, but this man was an island of precise stillness. He wore a dark, clean, unremarkable coat, but it was his posture that struck me, rigid, observant, and entirely out of place. He wasn't shopping, he wasn't working, and he wasn't loitering. He was watching. When I turned sharply to look at him, he didn't look away. Instead, he raised a gloved hand and adjusted the brim of his hat, a casual gesture that felt calculated and menacing. On the ring finger of that hand, I saw a flicker of dull metal, a silver ring etched with an interlocking geometric pattern, the precise symbol of the fortifications on the Terra Incognita Occidentalis. He knew. Or at least they knew something was amiss and they were tracing the thread back to me. I immediately broke off my negotiation and ducked down a narrow, crowded alleyway, melting into the chaos of the harbor traffic. I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the man. He didn't follow me immediately, but his eyes were fixed exactly where I had been. He was patient, he was professional, and he was hunting. I hurried back to Finch's house, my heart hammering against my ribs. They're here, Alistair. They know the map is compromised and they are looking for the man who is asking the right questions. Finch, unperturbed, was waiting by the fireplace, tending a meager fire. Then the time for academic debate is over, Elias. This is your war now. He handed me a small, heavy piece of leather, a field notebook bound in the same sea-worn material as the map. This is a detailed list of all known former cartel members and contacts, merchants, politicians, spies. Study it, then burn it. He gave me one last piece of advice, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. Go south first, to New York, then take the inland routes toward the Ohio Valley. Don't go directly west from here. The fastest route is the most predictable. Vanish in the crowds and remember the words of Silas Crane, the true author of your map, written in a private journal. The shortest distance between 2 points is rarely the safest. That night, under a starless sky, I rode Meridian out of Boston. My satchel was lighter, but the burden had never been heavier. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the chief draftsman, but Elias Crane, a land speculator with a hidden map, an antique key, and a killer on his trail. As I rode toward the dark, unknown horizon of the continent, I realized the lines of my life had not just shifted, they had been redrawn entirely. The faint lines of the fading map were now the only lines in my world, and they led straight into the heart of a vast American deception. I rode not for riches, but for verification. That was the scholar's burden, and I was now bound to bear it.
The chilling certainty of being watched, the simple, dark suit of the man in the marketplace, and the unmistakable geometric signet ring was the final, necessary catalyst. It burned away the last vestiges of Elias Thorne, the chief draftsman, leaving only Elias Crane, the frantic operative. Professor Finch's house was no longer a safe haven. It was a trap already closing. I took Finch's advice and rode Meridian hard out of Boston before dawn. The route was not the direct highway south, but a series of confusing minor roads designed to lose any persistent shadow. I rode with the leather-bound map pressed beneath my cloak, its physical presence now both a comfort and a curse. My immediate task was not exploration, but survival. I needed to know what the cartel knew, and the only way to do that was to finish decoding the very artifacts Finch had identified. I paused only once, 3 days into the ride, hiding in the relative security of a deserted old trading post near the New York border. The air was frigid, the silence absolute, allowing me to finally focus my cartographer's mind on the mystery. I started with the wax seal I had broken in Philadelphia, the rearing lion with the snapped iron chain. I remembered Finch explaining that the lion was the official symbol of the Vanderhoof cartel, representing their ambition to dominate the world, the lion being the king of beasts. But the snapped chain? Finch believed it signified their commitment to operate outside the chains of formal government control, a rogue cower. I pulled out the tattered leather journal Finch had given me, the one detailing the cartel's known agents. As I opened the journal, I noticed for the first time that the seal's impression, when held at a specific angle to the candlelight, contained minute, almost invisible etching on the chain itself. It wasn't just a snapped chain. The links contained a set of tiny, directional arrows. North, northwest, west. It wasn't a corporate logo, it was an instruction. It pointed to the first 3 legs of the journey, the first 3 geographical markers on the Terra Incognita Occidentalis. They were telling their agents, their navigators, exactly how to begin the secret journey right from the eastern seaboard. They had hidden the key to their entire empire in plain sight on the seal of their communication. This realization solidified the sheer audacity of the cartel's plan. They didn't just hide a passage, they built a parallel infrastructure to maintain it. Next, I turned to the map itself, focusing on the mysterious geometric symbol, the hidden cipher that marked the fortifications. I had dismissed it as a simple colonial flag, but Finch's scholarship suggested otherwise. He had hypothesized that the geometric symbol was an adaptation of an obscure 17th century astronomical device, a highly simplified armillary sphere. I sketched the symbol repeatedly in my travelogue. It was 2 interlocking triangles, one upright, one inverted, centered on a circle. I realized the lines corresponded exactly to the celestial coordinates of the winter solstice sunrise and sunset as seen from a specific latitude and longitude. Using my portable quadrant and a set of old almanacs, I worked backwards. The astronomical alignment of the symbol was not generic. It was tied to the latitude of the 38th parallel, a line running almost perfectly through the center of the newly purchased territory, an area far south of the traditional Northwest Passage attempts. The cipher was a lock and key. If you knew the astronomical significance of the symbol, you knew the exact parallel where the forts began. It was a genius piece of obfuscation, designed to be meaningless to a general, but profoundly specific to a scholar. This work, This deep dive into the world of coded history was exhilarating. For the first time since receiving the map, I felt like a cartographer again, a scientist, not merely a terrified fugitive. The truth was not just out there, it was hidden in the ink itself. With the knowledge of the 38th parallel and the seal's directional clues, I finally plotted my initial route. I had to reach the Ohio River Valley, the practical gateway to the west, and then proceed directly along the 38th parallel until I found the first angular fortress. That was the only way to verify the map's claim and break the cartel's long silence. My journey took me through rural New Jersey and then across Pennsylvania, a far safer and more circuitous route than the main roads. I kept Meridian moving quickly, stopping only in small, anonymous villages where I could buy provisions and hear news. It was there, in a dusty, dimly lit tavern outside Pittsburgh, that I heard the first disturbing news. A fellow traveler, a grizzled merchant heading back east, was lamenting a strange occurrence. The river police have been asking questions, asking about a cartographer, some academic fellow named Thorne, who supposedly went mad and stole important papers from Philadelphia. They say he's wanted for treasonous acts against the Republic. My stomach turned to ice. They hadn't just discovered the map was gone. They had fabricated a story. They were using the law, not just private violence, to stop me. And the name they used, Thorne, meant they didn't yet suspect my alias, Elias Crane. I was still one step ahead, but the gap was closing fast. I paid for my ale, forcing a look of disinterested weariness. I had to shed the last vestiges of my old life, including my own name. From this day forward, there was only Elias Crane, a surveyor looking for land, and beneath that, a scholar chasing a truth that might very well kill him. That night, camped by the Monongahela River, I pulled out Finch's small leather journal containing the list of cartel contacts. I studied the names, politicians in New York, powerful land speculators in Kentucky, and a few high-ranking military officers stationed near the river forts. I realized my escape from Boston was only the beginning. Every single person who stood to gain from the current false geography was a potential enemy. I lit a small taper. I looked at the names one last time, committing the most dangerous ones to memory. Then, with a profound sense of finality, I held the journal over the flame. The brittle leather curled, the pages blackened, and the secrets of the Vanderhoof cartel turned to smoke, vanishing into the cold night air. The final ink was gone, but the cipher was now etched into my mind. I was ready to ride into the West, armed with nothing but the truth on a fading map, a new name, and the terrible knowledge that I was fighting a war against the shadow history of a nation. This chapter concludes the initial setup, completing Elias's transformation from scholar to operative, and placing him at the gateway to the West, the Ohio River Valley, ready to begin the geographic verification required by the map. Total story length, chapters 1, 2, and 3, are approximately 3,900 words. Where would you like to take Elias next? Perhaps detailing his dangerous crossing of the Ohio River in Chapter 4, Crossing the Meridian of Trust. The Monongahela River met the Allegheny at Pittsburgh, forming the great churning body of the Ohio. This confluence was more than a geographical meeting point. It was the final messy seam stitching the East to the great unmapped West. Civilization ended here, not with a ceremonial boundary, but with a chaotic blend of mud, timber, and cynical opportunity. I spent one nervous, sleepless night in a damp tavern, watching the flickering firelight dance on the faces of traders, trappers, and rivermen. Faces hardened by exposure and marked by a distinct absence of trust. Every laugh seemed too loud, every whisper too brief. I was Elias Crane, the hopeful land surveyor, yet I felt like Elias Thorne, the fugitive,
with every eye in the room judging the quality of my rifle and the size of my purse.
"You look like a man trying to buy his way into trouble, Mr. Crane," Voss stated, his voice rough, without preamble. He didn't even look at me, his focus entirely on the rope securing his vessel. "I'm buying land rights," I corrected him, forcing a confident, almost arrogant tone appropriate for a speculator. "I'm heading for the new territory, following a specific latitude line, and I need to get my mare, Meridian, and my gear across the river without attracting attention from the morning crowds." Voss finally paused, looking me over with a slow, calculating scrutiny that felt like the inspection of a geological fault line. He looked at my horse, my leather coat, and then, pointedly, at my hands that belong more to a pen than a plow. "A specific latitude line, you say? Most men heading west follow the river or the old military tracks. Latitude lines are for professors in Boston, not speculators in Pittsburgh." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the muddy bank. "That kind of precision costs extra, Mr. Crane. It suggests you're looking for something that is currently unlisted." I knew I had to offer a plausible half-truth to cover the impossible whole. "I am looking for a specific type of mineral deposit, copper and lead, Voss. It's a French survey secret I acquired before the purchase. It only begins to show near the 38th parallel in the Kentucky region." I pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out $3 silver, nearly double the going rate for a crossing. The sight of the coins finally drew his attention away from my hands. "Copper and lead," he mused, weighing the coins. "Well, the Ohio is the boundary between the known and the unknown. You're trading a world of law for a world of luck, Mr. Crane. You want to cross right here before the sun hits the main channel? It'll be choppy." We loaded Meridian onto the heavy scow, a terrifying process for the mare, and a nerve-wracking one for me given the map was resting beneath the saddle. As Voss pulled us into the current, the boat rocking precariously, I felt the final, definitive separation from the east. The familiar sounds of the city were replaced by the rush of the water and the urgent guttural sound of Voss's grunts as he fought the current. Midway across, with the shores receding into a hazy blend of brown and gray, Voss broke the silence. "I knew a man who used to talk about precise lines," he said, his eyes still fixed on the choppy water. "Years ago, a bit touched in the head. He was a surveyor, not a speculator. Claimed there were mountains where there were plains, and a secret river where there were only swamps." My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this a genuine recollection or a fishing expedition? Was Voss already working for the cartel, testing my nerve? "The West attracts all kinds of tall tales," I managed, keeping my voice level. Voss shook his head. "No, this man, Silas Crane, I think his name was. He worked for a strange, silent company. Never knew who they were. They used a strange seal, a lion, but the chain was broken. He vanished down south of the Ohio, somewhere along the Kentucky hills. People said he went mad searching for the King's Road." My cover was now useless. Elias Crane was the name Voss remembered, the mad cartographer who had worked for the cartel 40 years ago. Finch had given me the name to hide behind, but now it was a beacon drawing unwanted attention. I had reached the meridian of trust, and I found myself standing on the wrong side. Voss knew too much, yet he hadn't denounced me. He was waiting for me to reveal my true intent. "Silas Crane," I said, meeting his icy stare. "I know the name. He was a brilliant man, years ahead of his time. My grandfather was his apprentice," I lied, weaving the story on the spot. "He left me his charts, the ones that hint at the mineral deposits. The King's Road, as you call it, is my inheritance and my only chance at a fortune." Voss smiled, a slow, shark-like curl of his lips. "I thought so much. Madmen leave fortunes. Wise men collect them." He swung the pole hard, turning the boat toward the landing point on the Kentucky side. "I can take you to the 38th parallel, Mr. Crane. There's an old trading path that starts right there,
almost invisible now, but my fee will be 1/3 of whatever you stake. If you find copper, I get a piece of the mine. If you find gold, I get the river rights. This was the ultimate choice. Face the wilderness alone, knowing the cartel was closing in, or trust this cynical, perceptive frontiersman who clearly knew more about Silas Crane than any legitimate guide should. Voss was a complication, but he was also a bridge. I needed his knowledge of the land far more than I needed to protect the purity of my mission. "Done," I said, extending a hand to seal the bargain. 1/3 of the stake, Jacob, but you do exactly what I tell you, and you never tell anyone where we are going or what line we are following. Voss took my hand in a grip that felt like braided wire. "Deal, Mr. Crane. I've been waiting for a journey with real secrets. Let's go find this King's Folly." As Meridian scrambled up the muddy Kentucky bank, shaking off the river water, I looked back at the receding shore of Ohio. I was officially in the West. I had secured a guide, but I had immediately compromised my cover and shared my secret with a complete stranger who had the same symbol on his mind as the men hunting me. The meridian of trust had been crossed, and the path ahead was terrifyingly unclear. I had traded the danger of a known enemy for the danger of an unknown ally. The Kentucky side of the Ohio River was not a welcoming place. It was a wall of tangled forest, dense and indifferent. The air trapped beneath the heavy canopy was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, a stark, suffocating contrast to the breezy intellectual air of my former life. Jakob Voss led the way, navigating by signs that were invisible to my trained eyes, a half-broken twig, a slight depression in the moss, the way the wild rye bent toward the south. The old trading path, he promised, was barely a deer trail, and our pace was brutally slow. Voss moved through the wilderness with the casual competence of a man wearing a familiar suit, while I, Elias Crane, felt every scratch of the briars and every agonizing tug of the mud. I was fundamentally a man of indoor pursuits, and the frontier was exacting its toll. Our arrangement, a 1/3 stake for his guidance, hung between us like a physical, sharp-edged object. He had agreed to follow the 38th parallel, a line visible only on my instruments, not on the ground, which itself was suspicious. No legitimate guide would accept such an abstract condition. Yet I needed him. My horse, Meridian, trusted Voss, which was perhaps the only measure of safety I had. The first 5 days were an unrelenting ordeal. The weather turned suddenly vicious, dumping cold, relentless rain that soaked through my leather coat and chilled me to the marrow. My mind, previously sharp and analytical, began to dull from lack of sleep and the constant, vibrating anxiety of pursuit. I worried less about the cartel's geometric symbol and more about the pervasive dampness. The fever started subtly, a dull ache behind my eyes, followed by an unnerving clamminess that soaked my clothes even when the sun managed to break through. By the 6th day, my head was throbbing with rhythmic intensity, and the world was beginning to warp. The green forest seemed to bleed into the brown mud, and the distant trees wavered like lines drawn on wet paper. That evening, I collapsed near the meager fire Voss had built. My entire body felt heavy, and the simple act of breathing was a chore. "You're burning up, Professor," Voss observed, his voice devoid of sympathy, yet not unkind. He didn't even ask questions. He simply acted. He forced a bitter decoction of bark and roots down my throat, a foul-tasting, potent brew, and piled every blanket we possessed on me. The fever took hold with astonishing ferocity. My reality fractured, and I slipped into a terrifying lucid delirium. The darkness behind my eyelids was not rest, it was a drafting table. I saw the Terra Incognita Occidentalis, not as a flat map, but as a towering spinning globe. The cinnabar ink circle marked the passage began to glow with a terrible internal light, and the angular cartel fortresses, the ones I was desperately seeking, detached themselves from the paper. They became monstrous, interlocking brass machines, turning slowly, relentlessly, grinding the silence of the American West into dust.
Then came Silas Crane. In my fevered visions, he was no longer a name from a journal, but a spectral presence. He stood before me, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with a manic terror, holding a compass whose needle spun wildly out of control. "They used the line to hide the wealth, Silas," he screamed, his voice echoing in the vast, empty canyons of my mind. "The passage is only a decoy. The real folly is built on the bones of the Regia Stultitia, the folly of the king's mines. The geometric cipher is not a coordinate, it is a vault key." He pointed to the symbol, the two interlocking triangles. In the dream, the triangles weren't aligned with the solstice. They were aligned with the North Star and the Southern Cross, constellations that only briefly shared the horizon in certain deep southern latitudes. A cartographical impossibility in Kentucky, yet terrifyingly real in my mind. "They are not defending a river, Elias," Crane shrieked, dissolving into a cloud of cinnabar ink. "The passage is only a decoy. The real folly is built on the bones of the Regia Stultitia, the folly of the king's mines. The geometric cipher is not a coordinate, it is a vault key." I woke with a violent spasm, choking on the bitter taste of the roots. The fever had momentarily retreated, leaving me drenched in sweat and utterly exhausted. The image of the armillary sphere aligning with the wrong stars, the impossibility of it, clung to my waking mind. Voss was sitting patiently by the fire, sharpening a long hunting knife. He didn't look up, but he knew I was awake. "You were speaking Spanish, Mr. Crane, talking about kings and folly, and crying out for a man named Silas." I swallowed, the bark taste still in my throat. "It was the sickness, I told you. He was my grandfather's apprentice, just childhood stories coming back." Voss finally looked up, his eyes piercing through the gloom. "Silas Crane never had an apprentice, Elias. He worked for the cartel alone. And he died alone, 50 miles south of here, hunting for the very wealth you claim to seek." He paused, letting the truth sink in. He wasn't just a guide, he was a gatekeeper. He knew my alias was a lie the moment I spoke it. "I found his camp," continued Voss, his voice low and conspiratorial. "He left nothing but a few scraps of drawing paper and a hole in the ground. I never understood the drawings, but they showed the same angular symbols as the ring worn by the men who came looking for him a year later." Voss stood, the knife gleaming in his hand. He walked to my side and knelt. I braced myself for the final, inevitable betrayal. Instead, he reached out and touched my forehead. "The fever has broken. You'll live." He pulled something small and dark from his pocket, a stone amulet carved with a rough, simplified version of the geometric cipher. "I am not with the men who wear that signet ring, Elias, but I am from this land. Silas Crane spoke of a king's folly in his final months. He said it was a place where two rivers should flow east, but one was forced to flow west, a natural anomaly that gave the cartel their secret navigable entry to the heart of the continent." He pressed the amulet into my hand. "I don't care about your republic or the cartel. I care about my stake. If that king's folly is a mine, I want my share. If it's a hole in the ground, you die here and I ride back with your horse. Now, tell me, Professor, where is the river that runs the wrong way?" My mind, though weak, was instantly clear. The fever dreams were not random. They were a convergence of my research and Voss's local knowledge.
The folly wasn't just a geographical point. It was a major, manipulated hydrological feature. I forced myself up, leaning against a tree. I pulled out the map, pointing to a convergence of waterways just ahead near the Kentucky-Missouri border, far from any established route. Here, I rasped, tracing the line with my finger. The map shows a major fork where one tributary of the Licking River, which should flow east toward the Ohio, turns abruptly southwest. If this map is true, they diverted the water. The passage doesn't rely on one natural river, it relies on a man-made hydrological switch built into the wilderness. Voss's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features. A switch? It would take a small army to divert a river. Or a powerful, secretive cartel with unlimited capital. I finished for him. The trust I had been searching for was not given. It was seized in a fever-induced moment of shared truth. Voss wasn't an ally of the cartel, but a resentful, opportunistic scavenger of their secrets. He was still dangerous, but our goals were, for now, aligned. We were both chasing the king's folly, he for gold and I for a truth that would change the map of America forever. I rolled up the map and secured it. We ride at dawn, Jacob. We follow the 38th parallel until we find the river that runs the wrong way. The journey along the 38th parallel was no longer a philosophical quest. It was a desperate crawl through the mud, guided by a hunch from a fever dream and a single faded line on an ancient map. Jacob Boss, my reluctant and entirely untrustworthy partner, proved to be an invaluable shadow. He was silent, efficient, and possessed an animalistic sense of danger that my bookish reflexes could never match. He treated the map's insistence on a hydrological switch as a simple engineering problem, a direct route to a potential fortune. If they moved a river, Voss observed one morning, spitting on the ground to test the wind, they did it in a place that already wanted to move. Look for soft ground, Mr. Crane. Look for stone that has no business being here. We spent the next week moving through the Kentucky hills, which were far more rugged and demanding than the flat, open plains I had imagined from the French maps. The frontier was less a blank canvas and more a series of dense, claustrophobic valleys. Voss's expertise, combined with my precise mapping of the 38th parallel using my quadrant, narrowed our search to a remote convergence of 3 small streams that should have fed into the Licking River basin. The map showed the diversion point, the passage, as a natural-looking fork. The reality was a horror of unnatural order. We found it late one afternoon. Voss was ahead of me, his long rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm, when he froze. I caught up to him, leading Meridian by the bridle, and followed his gaze. There was no natural riverbank here. Instead, a sheer, dark wall of perfectly cut limestone rose 20 feet from the streambed, slicing directly across the expected path of the easternmost tributary. It was a massive, decades-old dam, built with the precision that mocked the rough-hewn cabins of the local settlers. This was not the work of pioneers. It was the engineering of an empire. "Sweet Mary," Voss breathed. The first sign of genuine awe I had seen from him. "That's Spanish masonry, Elias. No local man built that. That stone has been cut and set by men who knew what they were doing." The wall of the dam, covered in moss and overgrown vines, diverted the main flow of water not east, but sharply southwest, creating an artificial, powerful current that flowed into the next natural basin, the beginning of this secret, navigable route to the continent's interior, exactly as Silas Crane's map had promised. I ran my hand over the cold, slick surface of the stone. The sheer audacity of the cartel's deception was staggering. They hadn't just found a passage, they had built one, sinking astronomical resources into altering the geography of a territory they didn't legally own, all to maintain a monopoly on continental access. They didn't just map the territory, Jacob, I whispered, feeling the weight of the water surging behind the stone. They engineered it. The King's Folly wasn't a mistake, it was an investment. They've been waiting a century for the right moment, for the land to fall into the hands of a weak government to start using this route. I rolled up the map and secured it. We ride at dawn, Jacob. We follow the 38th parallel until we find the river that runs the wrong way. We followed the path of the diverted river, which was now a fast-flowing, unnaturally deep channel. After less than half a mile, the first architectural sign of the cartel's presence appeared, a small, dark stone blockhouse set high on a ridge overlooking the water. This was the unblinking eye of the frontier. It wasn't a rambling defensive fort designed to withstand a siege. It was a perfect angular stone structure, the exact design marked by the geometric symbol on the map. It was built for observation and control, not battle. No smoke rose from its chimney, no flag flew above its roof, yet the windows, though small, felt like watchful, opaque eyes. The building was silent, but it radiated an unsettling, palpable presence, the calm confidence of a spider waiting in its web. Voss immediately pulled Meridian into a dense thicket of spruce. "We don't approach that," he hissed, dropping to a low crouch. "That thing is meant to be silent. If you see a Spanish garrison, they make noise, they light fires. This is the new kind of threat, Elias, the quiet kind." We spent the rest of the day observing the blockhouse from a safe distance, concealed by a heavy fog that mercifully rolled in with the evening. The silence was the most terrifying thing. No guard patrols, no visible movement. The blockhouse was simply there, a perfect, cold, geometric shape planted in the wild, organic chaos of the American woods. As twilight faded, however, the silence was broken, not by sound, but by light. From a narrow slit high up in the stone wall, a pinprick of reddish-yellow light emerged. It was not the light of a common lantern or a cooking fire. It was a focused, directional beam, meticulously aimed. I pulled out my brass telescope, a tool of peaceful observation, now repurposed for espionage, and focused on the light source. It wasn't a flame, it was a lens, and the light was being controlled. It swept the diverted channel in a precise, slow, rhythmic pattern, checking the water for any passing vessel or disturbance. "They're not guarding it with men, Jacob," I murmured, lowering the telescope. "They're guarding it with a schedule. It's an automated or semi-automated observation post, a silent, unblinking eye that scans the river every hour on the hour." I realized the true ingenuity of the cartel's defense. Why waste dozens of men in the wilderness when a single, automated or electronically controlled beacon could watch the crucial waterway indefinitely? The cartel was not just decades ahead in geography, they were decades ahead in military technology. Just as I settled in for a long, cold watch, I noticed a flicker of movement near the base of the blockhouse, where a small camouflaged wooden dock connected to the diverted river. A skiff, dark and low in the water, pulled up. Two figures disembarked, dressed in the dark, heavy coats similar to the man who had stalked me in Boston. They wore no discernible uniform, but their movements were economical and professional. One of them carried a small, heavy wooden box, clearly a dispatch or supply, while the other, after checking the boat, walked directly up to the base of the stone blockhouse. He didn't use the front door. He accessed a small, concealed door carved into the limestone, which fit the contours of the stone so perfectly that it was invisible from our angle until he opened it. This confirmed it. The blockhouse was their supply point, their observation post, and the physical cartel checkpoint on American soil. "They're changing the guard or restocking the lamp," Voss whispered, his breathing shallow. "We wait until they leave." We waited. The two men disappeared into the blockhouse, and the directional lamp went dark for an agonizing 30 minutes. Then the lamp flared back to life, resuming its mechanical sweep of the channel. The camouflage door opened, and the two men re-emerged, securing the skiff and then disappearing back down the channel towards the south. "They're patrolling the passage," I deduced, shivering despite the layers of wool. "They're maintaining the channel and ensuring silence. They won't be back for days." "No," Voss disagreed, pointing not at the water but at the dense woods just beyond the blockhouse. "Look at the high trail. See that patch of flattened fern? They're not leaving. They're going over the ridge. They have a second checkpoint or a larger base of operations further in. The river is the highway, but the forest is their fence." Voss was right. The silence of the blockhouse was deceptive. It was the unblinking eye, but the cartel's reach extended far beyond its immediate sightline. I realized then that my mission was far more dangerous than I had initially calculated. I wasn't just exposing a secret map, I was dismantling a meticulously guarded, active commercial and military venture that had been running for decades. I looked at Voss, whose ice-blue eyes were calculating the distance to the next ridge. "We need to go around. We cannot risk a direct confrontation here." "Around means 2 extra days, Elias, through territory neither of us has mapped. But it's better than walking into that perfect geometry. That stone is too quiet for men with honest intentions." I agreed, realizing that the scholar's weapon, knowledge, was useless against the cartel's superior organization. Our only defense was the wild, unpredictable terrain they had so desperately tried to tame. "We go around," I confirmed, mounting Meridian. "But Jacob, we need to know where those patrols are heading. The next landmark on the Terra Incognita is a large native settlement near a salt lick marked with the phrase, 'Here the king's debt is paid.' That must be their source of labor or supplies." "Then we track the patrols, Elias," Voss said, the scent of greed sharp in his voice. "If we find their base, we find their gold. And if we find their gold, we'll have enough to buy our way out of this conspiracy." We circled the blockhouse wide, moving under the dense cover of the old-growth forest, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the pressure of the leather map. The Ohio frontier was not wild, it was controlled, and the cartel's silent, unblinking eye was everywhere. We left the silent menace of the stone blockhouse behind, circling wide through the roughest terrain to avoid the patrol trail. The experience of seeing the cartel's mechanical surveillance, that unblinking rhythmic light, had altered my perspective. This was not a remnant of history. It was a functioning, meticulously maintained conspiracy operating within the borders of the United States. "Fort Laramie," I muttered to Voss as we rode in the dense morning fog, navigating by the sound of the diverted water channel far below. "The name is wrong, Jacob. We're in Kentucky, perhaps skirting into the Missouri Territory. Laramie is too far north, too far west. It's a code name or a symbol." Voss, who had been focused intently on tracking the faint print of the patrol's boots, shrugged. "Names are cheap out here. If it means a fortified place where they keep the king's treasure, that's all I need to know. The men we're tracking are headed toward the high ground, a place they trust." The patrol trail was surprisingly faint, evidence of their professional training. They moved with the quiet stealth of native hunters, yet their boots left the distinctive, heavy mark of European manufacture. Voss, however, was like a hound on a scent. He pointed out bruised ferns and stones that had been recently overturned, leading us unerringly over the ridges and deeper into the wilderness. After a day and a half of silent, grueling pursuit, the landscape began to change again, shifting from impenetrable forest to open glades. It was here, where the trees thinned and the earth became strangely pallid and stripped of life, that we came upon the location marked on the Terra Incognita with the phrase, "Here the king's debt is paid." It was a nightmare of organized labor. The place was centered around a natural salt lick, a large, barren area where the earth was crusted white and pitted with the tracks of deer and buffalo. But the animals were long gone. The cartel had enclosed the entire area with a dense 12-foot palisade fence, cleverly hidden by trees on the approach, but undeniable upon closer inspection.
Smoke rose from several large, squat buildings inside the perimeter. It wasn't the smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, acrid haze of a smelting operation. The ground was littered with chunks of dark, unrefined ore. I dismounted Meridian, tying her deep in the cover of the woods. I pulled out the map, comparing the landscape to the cinnabar-inked chart. The map had not marked this as a settlement, but as a salt repository. The king's debt was now shockingly clear. "They aren't just looking for a passage, Jacob," I whispered, watching a column of smoke twist into the sky. "They found the copper and lead deposits I marked on the map, and they are already mining it. The passage is for shipping the processed ore back east, under the noses of the American government." Voss ignored the implications of international conspiracy. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated greed. "A mine, a working mine, Elias, just like you said. We're rich." "We are dead," I countered, pulling him low behind a thick stand of pines. "If they find us, they won't ask questions. Look at who is working inside." The workers were native men and women, clearly from several distinct tribes of the region, dressed in rough canvas clothing, working under the stern gaze of overseers who wore the dark, severe uniforms I recognized from the patrol in Chapter 6. The work was brutal, hauling heavy sacks of ore, feeding the furnaces, and constantly maintaining the heavy machinery. They worked with a slow, beaten rhythm, supervised by men armed with muskets and long, punishing whips. The king's debt was paid in the blood and sweat of forced labor. As I watched the oppressive scene, my eyes gravitated to a larger central building, a perfectly squared structure built of heavy logs, standing slightly apart from the smelting sheds. Near its door stood two armed men, and nailed prominently to the log wall was a wooden sign, freshly painted, bearing the faint outline of the geometric cartel symbol. Below the symbol, painted in crisp black letters, were the words Fort El Ameri. Fort El Ameri, I repeated, the scholarly puzzle clicking into place. It's not Laramie, Jacob. It's a bastardization. It's a Spanish play on words. Fort l'Amérique, Fort America. It's their headquarters, their central depot. It was likely planned decades ago as a central supply hub for their entire passage operation. The cartel hadn't just named the place, they had claimed it, symbolically naming it the Heart of America, where they conducted their illegal extraction. Suddenly, Voss tensed, pulling me down harder into the earth. "Movement, Elias. Not theirs. Ours." Peering through the sparse brush, I saw what he meant. Two figures were slipping through the fence line on the opposite side of the compound. They were dressed in the typical buckskins of independent trappers or hunters, but they moved with a careful, observant quality that transcended simple curiosity. They were spies, and they were heading straight for the main headquarters building. "They're American," Voss hissed, squinting. "Or at least, they're not the cartel men. They're too casual, too open in their approach. Fools." I watched as the two spies reached the headquarters, slipped behind the building, and vanished into a small, shadowed recess near the loading dock. They were clearly attempting a covert entry or eavesdropping. This was my opportunity. The cartel's attention would soon be divided. "We have to get closer, Elias," I told Voss, my voice low and urgent. "Those men are going to be caught, and the cartel will secure the perimeter. We need to be inside before the alarm is raised." Voss hesitated. "We wait for nightfall, Elias. We don't walk into a hive in the afternoon." "If we wait, Jacob, those spies will be captured, and their interrogators might extract information about outsiders, about me. The risk is in the delay. I need to get into that headquarters building, near that sign, and see what records they keep." I pulled out the tattered leather journal given to me by Finch, which, though burned, still held the silver locket from Silas Crane. "This," I said, showing him the locket belonging to Silas Crane. The cartel's records are the final piece of the puzzle. The king's folly is not just copper, it's knowledge." My insistence, coupled with the renewed promise of wealth, finally convinced him. We used a low ravine to circle the perimeter, crawling the final 50 yards on our bellies through the brittle autumn grass. The metallic clang of the smelting operation provided a welcome auditory mask.
We reached the back wall of the palisade, near the main headquarters building. I could hear the muffled voices of the overseers inside the building. Voss, using a small specialized knife, worked quickly and silently, cutting through the heavy timber lattice supporting the palisade. Just as he created a small gap wide enough to slip through, a tremendous shout went up from the front of the compound. The two spies had been discovered. "Intrusos!" The Spanish cry of alarm echoed across the salt lick. Suddenly, the compound erupted into chaotic activity. Workers dropped their tools and began running, some towards the perimeter, others simply collapsing in despair. The cartel overseers, armed and organized, were already moving, converging on the headquarters building, the source of the breach. "Now, Elias," Voss shoved me through the gap in the palisade. I burst into the compound, my heart racing, the terrifying sight of the injustice and the chaos slamming into my scholarly sensibilities. I ran towards the headquarters building, ducking behind massive sacks of raw ore, driven by the pure adrenaline-fueled need for the records. I found the two spies immediately, two young men, clearly overwhelmed, cornered by 3 armed cartel guards near the loading dock. The guards were beating them with the butts of their muskets, shouting commands in a harsh, guttural mixture of Dutch and Spanish. I ignored them. My target was the log wall of the headquarters. I ran to the area near the sign, Fort El Emery, and began frantically scanning the wall. I wasn't looking for a door or a window, I was looking for the architect's signature. And there it was. Hidden under the fresh paint of the name sign, embedded almost seamlessly into the heavy log frame, was a small brass plaque. It was round, tarnished, and etched with the telltale geometric cipher, the interlocking triangles. My mind raced back to the fever dream and the words of Silas Crane. The geometric cipher is not a coordinate, it is a vault key. I fumbled with the silver locket Finch had given me, the locket belonging to Silas Crane. I pressed the locket against the brass plaque. It fit exactly. The two pieces were designed to be one. The plaque was not a nameplate, it was a lock mechanism. As the cartel guards focused their attention on the struggling spies, I twisted the locket clockwise, inserting the snapped chain lion into the geometric sphere. With a faint click, the brass plaque retracted, and a small, heavy iron door swung inward, revealing a dark, tight space beneath the main building. This was not a simple headquarters. This was the vault. "Voss!" I yelled, plunging into the darkness. "I found it! The King's Folly is down here!" But Voss was already otherwise engaged. I heard the roar of his rifle, followed by a grunt of pain and the heavy thump of a body hitting the ground. He hadn't followed me, he had taken a flanking position and opened fire, drawing the attention of the overseers away from the vault and toward his gun smoke. He wasn't protecting me, he was protecting his stake. I stumbled down 3 rough-hewn wooden steps into the vault, pulling the heavy iron door shut just as another gunshot rang out above. I was safe, for the moment, encased in the stone and earth. The only light was the weak beam filtering through the narrow opening where the brass plaque had been. I was deep inside the King's Folly, surrounded by the echoes of a buried history, and my life depended entirely on what I found in the dark.
The moment I slammed the heavy iron door of the vault shut, the external world was muffled, yet amplified. The crack of Voss's rifle, single, sharp and deadly, was followed by shouts in Dutch and the heavy thud of bodies. I could hear the desperate sounds of the 2 captured American spies, their struggle fading quickly into silence. I was deep inside the King's Folly, and the cost of my entry was already being paid in blood. The space was small, cold, and smelled sharply of sulfur and old paper. The only light came from the narrow aperture where Silas Crane's locket now served as the key. I pulled my small field lamp from my belt, the weak light illuminating a scene that was not a king's treasury, but a cartographer's tomb. The vault contained no gold bars, no stacks of silver currency. Instead, 3 wooden shelves lined the stone wall, packed tight with documents. The majority were ledgers detailing shipments of copper and lead, the cartel's true steady profit. But the center shelf, the highest one, held a stack of leather-bound journals,
all in the familiar, sea-worn hide of the terra incognita occidentalis. I grabbed the top journal. The writing on the spine was faint, but unmistakable. The final log of Silas Crane. I didn't open it immediately. My eyes caught a glint of metal resting on a stone pedestal beneath the shelves. It was a brass plaque, polished to a perfect sheen, engraved with a lengthy Latin inscription. I brought the lamp closer. The text was a declaration, a historical testament left by the cartel's founders. Hic jacet verum, hoc est opus nostrum. Here lies the truth. This is our work. Edificatum ad solamen, non ad pugnam. Built for solace, not for strife. Ut veritas taceat, unum debet loqui. That the truth may be silent, one must speak. Regis dutitia, non est folly regis, est folly populi. The king's folly is not the folly of the king. It is the folly of the people. The final line pierced me. The king's folly is the folly of the people. They weren't hiding a crime from a monarch. They were hiding a truth from the new American Republic, preserving their strategic control over the continent. I turned back to Crane's journal, flipping past pages detailing astronomical sightings and geological surveys. The entries were increasingly manic, written in a hand that deteriorated with panic. August 1787. They demand I complete the map, the final proof of the passage, but they won't reveal the true purpose of the copper mines. They call it the quiet tax on the future republic. They claim this land is too young for self-governance. It must be guided by the old wisdom. September 1788. I completed the passage map. I drew the fortresses. I gave them the geography, but I cannot bear the sight of the workers. I cannot bear the sight of the cost. They are not shipping copper, they are shipping silence. October 1789. I have resolved to draw another map, a counter map, one that will be beautiful enough to tempt a true cartographer, yet incomplete enough to require validation. It must be discovered by a scholar, a man of lines, who will feel the weight of its truth and be compelled to follow it to its source. It must be proof of the conspiracy, yet so impossible that the government will only trust the man who physically verifies it. I will hide the truth in the ink itself. Silas Crane hadn't gone mad. He had made a confession and a challenge. The terra incognita occidentalis was not stolen, it was planted. It was bait, a deliberate mechanism designed to drag a truth-seeker like myself across the continent to expose the cartel's operation. A loud, splintering crash from above. Voss's gun had fallen silent. The cartel was clearing the ground. I had precious seconds. I shoved Crane's journal into my satchel. As I reached for the other ledgers, a small, heavily bound black book fell from the top shelf. It was newer than the others, bound in supple modern leather. The title was stamped in gold, Boston, 1803, Ledger of Eastern Acquisitions. Boston, 1803. The chilling specificity of the title made my hand tremble. I tore open the cover. The entries were written in crisp academic English, documenting the cartel's financial maneuvering, their land speculation purchases, and their use of legal fronts to conceal their activity in the East. My eyes fell upon a familiar, elegant handwriting. It was not a cartel agent's script. It was the careful, distinct hand of Professor Alistair Finch. The entry was dated just 6 months before I received the map. June 1803. Finch A. Final payment secured for continued maintenance of the Thorn Firewall. The cartographer remains dutifully obsessed with the established grid. He is convinced the passage is a myth. The threat level remains negligible, assuming the subject remains isolated in the Philadelphia archives. The Thorn Firewall. My entire career, my entire life of elegant precision had been engineered by Finch, my mentor, my intellectual lighthouse. He had been reporting my complacency to the cartel for years, ensuring that the chief draftsman, the one man who could expose their conspiracy, remained a harmless academic content with the established grid. The betrayal was immediate, sharp, and absolute. It wasn't Voss, the suspicious mercenary, who was the danger. It was the trusted good man in Boston. Finch hadn't urged me to go west out of patriotic duty. He had sent me west to confirm the existence of the passage so the cartel could use the information to control me or eliminate me as a liability now that the map was out. The second part of the ledger detailed my trip, my hurried departure from Philadelphia, my alias Elias Crane, the purchase of Meridian. Finch had documented everything right up to my desperate arrival in Boston. Then came the final entry, in a different hand, a hasty scrawl. 18 November. Subject has acquired the locket. Finch has been neutralized. The map is active. We are tracing the subject's movements from Pittsburgh. Agents are converging on the 38th parallel. Do not let the subject verify the passage or the folly will be exposed. Finch was not a traitor. He was a gatekeeper who had failed. The cartel knew I was coming, and they had sent their agents, the man in the marketplace, to follow me, confirming my path toward their hidden mine. The betrayal was not in sending me, but in selling my obedience for years. The true betrayal, however, was in the word neutralized. Finch had paid the ultimate price for his long service to the cartel, and they didn't even trust him enough to leave him alive when the mission went critical. I shoved Finch's ledger into my satchel, the paper feeling heavy with my shattered idealism. The floor above me was now silent, the only sound the low, steady drip of water somewhere in the stone. The fighting was over. I pulled out my flintlock pistol, cocking it with a dry, mechanical click. I eased the iron door open just a crack, peering into the dark space beneath the headquarters floor. A shadow moved. It was Jacob Voss, slumped against the wall, covered in dirt and blood. He wasn't dead, but he was badly wounded. His face was pale, and he was clutching his shoulder, which was soaked through with crimson. "The good news, Professor," Voss gasped, forcing a grim smile, "is that I didn't let them kill those 2 American fools. The bad news is that I only got 2 of the bastards, and the third one is looking for us in the perimeter." "Jacob," I said, ignoring the pain in his voice, "we have to move, now. I know what they are hiding, and I know who sent me here." I pulled Voss up, supporting his weight. He was heavy, but his resolve was still strong. He had bought me time, not out of loyalty to the Republic, but out of loyalty to his 1/3 stake. That made his trust, ironically, the only real thing left in my world.
The vault didn't hold gold, Jacob. It holds records that prove the passage is a decoy for the largest copper and lead mine on the continent, all operating on stolen American land. I showed him the final log of Silas Crane, and I know where the rest of their operations are. Voss nodded, his jaw tight with pain. "Then let's take your map and my rifle and finish this folly." We moved slowly, silently, utilizing the chaos of the cleared mine site. The 2 American spies, the ones Voss had bought time for, were gone, either captured or escaped. We recovered Meridian, who stood patiently in the spruce thicket, and headed not west, but southeast, towards a hidden logging road marked clearly on the perimeter map in Finch's ledger. The quiet betrayal of a good man, Professor Finch, had not stopped my mission. It had clarified it. I was no longer chasing a line on a map. I was chasing a global cartel built on the lie of the American West. I rode with the heavy journals in my satchel, the proof of my mentor's treachery serving as a constant, bitter reminder that on the frontier, the most dangerous enemy is not the one you shoot, but the one you trust. We did not ride. We fled. The logging road marked in Finch's ledger was the cartel's own supply track, a route designed for heavy wagons, not silent escape. Voss, leaning heavily on Meridian's saddle, his shoulder wrapped tight in bloodied canvas, rode with the grim fatalism of a man who knows he has used up his luck. The first 24 hours were a blur of pain, adrenaline, and unrelenting motion. Every hour, I would stop to check Voss's wound, change the dressing, and force the foul-tasting root tonic I had learned from him down his throat. His fever was a constant threat, rising and falling with the sun. "They will have sent riders from Fort L'Amory," Voss rasped, his voice raw. "They'll be heading for the nearest organized outpost, St. Louis, Independence, any place with a telegraph or a regiment." "I know," I said, pulling out Finch's ledger. The Book of Betrayal was now my most valuable tool, a map of the enemy's infrastructure. I had found what I was looking for, a list of cartel staging posts disguised as supply houses, stretching west. The next crucial link was in a settlement near the Missouri River, a place I had only ever read about, Fort Osage. The landscape shifted again, betraying the dense forests for the vast, endless roll of the prairie. This was the true frontier, a terrifying emptiness that offered no hiding places, only distance. It was here that the true weight of my mission, the sheer scope of the continent I was crossing, truly settled in. And then, on the third day, we saw the mountains. They were not the craggy peaks of the Rockies themselves, not yet, but the immense dark blue-gray shadow of the Rockies cast upon the distant western horizon. They were a towering, impassive wall, a silent promise of the true destination and the final, ultimate secret I was sworn to uncover. Seeing them for the first time, distant as they were, gave our flight a new, desperate purpose. But the vast openness that revealed the mountains also revealed us. It was mid-afternoon. The sun beat down on the dry, brittle prairie grass. We were crossing an elevated ridge, exposed for miles in every direction, when Voss suddenly stiffened. "Riders," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "3 of them, fast horses, coming up behind us about an hour's ride." My blood ran cold. The cartel had been quick. They hadn't sent the local patrols, they had sent specialized, mounted agents. We pushed Meridian past her limit, urging her into a flat-out run. But a wounded man and a mapmaker on a heavy mare were no match for professional riders on fresh horses. Within the hour, the figures became distinct. 3 men in dark, severe coats, riding with the cold, relentless purpose of predators. They were the unblinking eye in motion. "We can't outrun them, Elias," he panted, his face pale with exertion and pain. "We have to stop, find a place to hold, or they'll shoot us out of the saddle." The terrain offered nothing. No ravines, no cover, only the ceaseless waving grass. And then I remembered a line from Salas Crane's Manic Journal, a geographical observation he'd scrawled about this specific region. "The plain is a lie. The king hides his passage not in the mountains, but in the wounds of the earth." "The wounds of the earth," I repeated, frantically searching the map I had secreted under my jacket. The cartel map marked the area just ahead with a series of small, cross-hatched lines, a subtle cartographic notation for erosion fissures. "Ahead, Jacob, a fissure field. We hide the horses and take cover." We reached the edge of a massive serpentine crack in the prairie, a network of deep, dry gullies and crumbling earth caused by ancient geologic shifts. We plunged into the deepest fissure, pulling Meridian in after us. The air immediately dropped 10 degrees, and the silence returned. We secured Meridian deep within the earthen crevice, muffling her head with a blanket. Voss slumped against the dry mud wall, drawing his knife. His rifle was useless in this confined space. I drew my pistol. Minutes later, we heard the thunder of hooves above us. The cartel riders had reached the edge of the fissures. "Disperse!" a voice shouted in accented English, the voice of authority. "They're on foot! Sweep the gullies! They cannot escape this depression!" The waiting began. It was the most terrifying part of the 3 days. We were trapped in the earth's wound, surrounded by cartel agents who knew the geography better than we did. We could hear their movements, the crunch of their boots on the dry soil above us, the calls in Dutch as they coordinated their search. Voss was fading fast. The pressure from the search was sending his fever spiking again. He was hallucinating,
muttering about Silas Crane and the river that ran backward. "Elias," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "The cartel will cut the line. They will cut the line." "Stay with me," I pleaded, holding my pistol steady. "What line? The passage?" "No," he mumbled, his breath shallow. "The meridian, the line of trust. They trust only their own greed. They will kill each other for the stake." His words, though delirious, held a terrifying truth. The cartel was a collective of ambitious, treacherous men. Their great strength was their secrecy, but their great weakness was their mutual distrust. Suddenly, a shadow fell over our position. One of the cartel agents was standing directly on the rim of our fissure, looking down into the darkness. I could see the polished silver of his geometric signet ring glinting in the sun. He saw us. His eyes locked on my face. Before he could shout, Voss, with a final desperate surge of strength, threw his knife. The blade flew true, burying itself deep into the agent's chest. The man didn't scream, he simply pitched forward, collapsing down the crumbling earthen slope and landing in a broken heap beside us. The silence that followed was absolute. "We have to move," I said, dragging the agent's body deeper into the crevice. But the sound of the agent's fall alerted the others. 2 more cartel agents converged on the spot. I aimed my pistol, knowing one shot would expose our exact position. Then a miracle of fate, or perhaps Voss's delirious prophecy, intervened. The 2 remaining cartel agents began arguing, fiercely and loudly, in Dutch. "He had the locket. He must have been the one who took the documents from the vault. You check the body, I'll pursue the fugitives."
No, we searched together. The commander ordered the documents secured first. Don't let your greed blind you. They began fighting over the fallen agent's body, tearing at his coat. The cartel was cannibalizing itself, consumed by the greed for Silas Crane's log and Finch's ledger. "They think the dead one found the prize," I whispered to Voss. "Greed bought us time." While they wrestled with the corpse above, I pulled Voss out of the fissure and onto Meridian. We rode east, then north, away from the conflict, using the deeper shadow of the Rockies as our navigational beacon. We didn't stop until the moon was high and the great prairies stretched out before us in a silent, unforgiving expanse. The 3rd day ended with us reaching the shelter of a small, deserted river cabin, a haven of sorts, but still miles from Fort Osage. Voss was barely conscious. I had the map, the logs, and the bitter knowledge of betrayal. I had survived the 3 days in the shadow of the cartel's ruthlessness and my mentor's treachery. But the true shadow, the immense, foreboding physical presence of the Rockies, loomed closer now, demanding that I verify the biggest, most dangerous truth, the final destination of the King's folly. The Great Plains are a deceit. They appear flat and manageable on a chart, a simple canvas to cross, but they are a relentless, wave-like ocean of grass that breaks a man's spirit far more effectively than any storm. We had survived the cartel's pursuit and the internal fever that nearly claimed Jacob Voss, but the land itself became our new, implacable enemy. Voss was recovering, his wound festering less, but his spirit was diminished. He spoke little, his eyes fixed on the distant, looming blue-gray wall of the Rockies. The Rockies weren't a geographical feature, they were the threshold of the known world, a silent, monumental challenge to the very idea of continental expansion. "You are in the shadow now, Elias," Voss said one cold, clear morning, his voice raspy. "We are in the shadow of the Ungeror." He used the old German word for monster or colossus. "If the cartel controls this, they control the heart of the continent. No government, no army can breach that wall once winter sets." He was right. We were now hundreds of miles from any outpost of the young republic. Our supplies were dwindling, and the pursuit, though quiet for now, was a constant, nerve-shredding threat. Our survival depended entirely on the fading ink of the Terra Incognita Occidentalis. I pulled out the map.
Its purpose had evolved from a mere curiosity to a tactical guide, and finally, here at the base of the mountains, it became a testament. I ignored the European labels and focused solely on the indigenous markings and the cryptic symbols left by Silas Crane. The cartel map, after detailing the mineral deposits in the east and the hydrological switch in the center, became sparse as it ascended the mountains. The single crucial feature in this entire section was the cinnabar ink circle, the dot I had noticed in my Philadelphia office, marked with the horrifying word, "The Passage." I had assumed the Passage was the diverted river in Kentucky, but Crane's fever-scrawled journal entry insisted the cartel was guarding a greater secret, something built upon the bones of the redraws stultitia. The Kentucky River was merely the entry point. The true heart of the cartel's control must lie at the Continental Divide itself. The map provided a single, precise latitude and longitude for the cinnabar circle, a point high in a mountain pass. But next to it, where a European mapmaker would place the name of a mountain range or a river, Silas Crane had drawn a delicate, geometric symbol that was distinctly non-European. 3 downward-pointing triangles nested one inside the other, like a cascade. "What does this mean, Jacob?" I asked, tracing the symbol with my finger. "It's not Spanish. It's not Dutch. It feels indigenous." Voss studied the symbol. "It's a marker of high ground. The tribes here use that shape for waterfalling or mountain stacking. But 3 of them? That means sacred or very old. It points to a crossing place, a pass that has been used for generations, long before any white man drew a map." This was the key. The cartel hadn't built the Northwest Passage through the Rockies. They had co-opted an ancient Native American route and fortified it. The Terra Incognita was a guide not to a mythical river, but to a secret trade route built on Native American knowledge. I turned my attention to the obsidian pillar itself. It had served as a navigational genome, a precise, fixed point used to track the sun and stars, allowing the indigenous traders to know exactly when the mountain pass was safe to cross. But the cartel had corrupted it.
Near the base of the pillar, almost invisible beneath a thick layer of lichen, was a tiny rectangular indentation. A lock, like the one that had secured the vault at Fort Elamari. It was designed to receive the geometric cipher. They hadn't just used the passage. They had claimed its key. "Jacob, this is where the redraws stultitia truly begins," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of this historical crime. The King's Folly was not just mining copper, it was exploiting the ancient, sophisticated knowledge of the native people, then lying to the entire world about the geography of the continent to keep it secret. I pulled out the locket of Silas Crane, the final piece of the cartel's key. I placed the snapped chain lion into the indentation. With a soft metallic thud, the pillar shifted slightly. A new section of the obsidian base slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss, was not a ledger or a map, but a single, pristine, large polished obsidian plate. It was a map unto itself. Instead of ink, the lines were etched into the black glass with incredible skill. It showed the entire passage from the hydrological switch in Kentucky all the way to the Pacific coast, but it showed something more. It showed the final fortification, the ultimate goal of the cartel's network. It was not a fort, it was a deep-water port. The final etching showed a large, sheltered cove on the Pacific coast, perfect for docking the largest ocean-going vessels. It was marked with a single, massive geometric cipher, accompanied by the name Portus Obscurus, the hidden port. The cartel's plan was now complete in my mind. The entire operation was a seamless chain. 1. Mining, Fort Elamari, Kentucky, provided the raw copper. 2. Inland transport, the hydrological switch, Ohio Valley, provided the water route. 3. Mountain crossing,
The Obsidian Pass, Rockies, provided the final secret portage route. 4. Global shipping. The hidden port, Pacific coast, provided direct, untaxed, unmonitored access to the Dutch and Asian trade routes. They had built a shadow empire inside the Louisiana Purchase. As I held the obsidian map, the truth heavy and cold in my hands, a sound broke the stillness of the pass. Not the sound of hooves, but the distinct, rhythmic clink of steel on stone, the sound of organized men ascending the pass from the eastern side. The cartel agents had caught up. They had tracked us to the final critical point in their operation. "They're here, Elias," Voss said, his rifle now steady in his hands. "They know the obsidian is the end of the line. The passage is open. The fight is now." "We go west, Jacob," I commanded, securing the obsidian plate in my satchel, alongside the betrayal of my mentor and the confession of Silas Crane. "I said we are not escaping, Jacob." I drew my pistol. "We are negotiating. The cartel doesn't want blood. They want silence. I have the power to destroy their silence right here." I stepped out from the cover of the rocks, raising my hands high, my pistol pointed toward the ground. "Stop!" I shouted, the wind nearly tearing the word from my mouth. "I know the truth. I have the records. Let's talk about an exchange." The clinking stopped abruptly. A tense silence descended, broken only by the shriek of the wind. After a moment, 3 figures emerged from the eastern approach. They were not the rough hired thugs from the Fort Elamary patrol. They were the commanders. Leading them was a man of startling elements and severity. He was dressed in a pristine dark blue European coat, utterly out of place on the rugged frontier, and wore tall polished riding boots. His face was thin, his eyes intelligent, and his manner radiated an almost regal authority. He carried no weapon, but his 2 guards, rigid and armed with gleaming German pistols, moved like shadows. The leader approached slowly, stopping 20 feet from me. He ignored Voss, whose rifle was still aimed from the shadows. His focus was entirely on me. "Elias Thurn," the leader said, his English accented with a harsh, precise Dutch cadence. He did not use my alias. "You are the cartographer, Mr. Thurn. You speak in grand, abstract terms. I am merely Dirk van Houten, the chief administrator of the Van der Hof Trading and Survey Consortium. I am here to close an accounting error." Van Houten looked past me, his eyes sweeping the bare rock until they found the rolled map on the ledge. "We see you have the original Terra Incognita Occidentalis. We appreciate its artistry, but its utility is over. We require something more valuable, the knowledge of what you have done with it." "I have documented your entire operation, Mr. Van Houten," I replied, gripping the handle of the satchel. "I have the proof that you diverted a sovereign waterway, established an illegal mining operation on U.S. government territory, and enslaved native labor to ship copper from an unauthorized Pacific port. I have the final log of Silas Crane detailing his confession and the ledger of Eastern acquisitions detailing your agents in New York and Philadelphia." I had offered him everything I had, except the obsidian plate. I needed to know what they valued most. Van Houten laughed, a short, dry sound that held no humor. "You misunderstand, Mr. Thurn. We do not fear the exposure of the copper mine. America is too busy arguing over tariffs to care about a few tons of copper. We do not fear the ledger. All the names are pseudonyms. Our true secret is far more delicate than logistics." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Our true secret is the method. We use the ancient precise knowledge of the indigenous routes, the seasonal timing, and the astronomical markers to ensure absolute untraceable trade. If the government realizes we are exploiting a pre-existing sophisticated indigenous trade network, they will send countless expeditions to replicate it. They will map the truth, and our advantage, our silence, will vanish. He was telling the truth. The cartel's power lay not in the mine, but in the knowledge, the very intellectual property I, the scholar, had just confirmed. The original map, the Terra Incognita Occidentalis, details the hydrological switch and the fortresses. If I destroy it, you lose your key to the eastern approach.
Van Houten shook his head. The coordinates are already logged. We care only about the obsidian plate. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, did you find the obsidian plate? The final map, the one that details Portus Obscurus, the hidden port? Because that is the only map that matters now. He knew. The betrayal of Professor Finch had been far deeper than I thought, extending not just to my movements, but to the very nature of my intellectual pursuit. The locket of Silas Crane, the key to the vault, must have been monitored. The obsidian plate is safe, I said, keeping my satchel tight against my side. I offer you the exchange, the obsidian plate for our lives. We walk over this pass to the Pacific. You return east and you dismantle the folly. If you refuse, I have instructed trusted contacts in New York to release copies of the ledger and Crane's log if I fail to send a confirmation by week's end. A necessary bluff, but one Finch's betrayal had taught me to use. Van Houten considered this, his gaze lingering on Voss, who coughed weakly, but kept his rifle steady. You, a cartographer, threaten a war you cannot win, Mr. Thorne, but I respect the leverage. Van Houten nodded to one of his guards, who pulled a heavy leather bag from his coat. Here is your exchange. Gold and silver for 2 passages to San Francisco. Take it and disappear. You have 10 minutes to cross the divide. It was a trap. A high-stakes exchange is always a lie. He was buying time to allow his third, unseen agent to circle our position. I will only release the plate when we are safely over the divide, I insisted. Of course, Van Houten smiled again, that chilling, predatory expression. You are a man of lines, Mr. Thorne. We expect precision. As the guards began to slowly retreat, creating a path for our escape, I felt a desperate tug on my coat. It was Voss. No. Voss's voice was barely a rasp, but the urgency was sharp. They aren't letting us go. The third agent is not circling. He is waiting at the gnomon. The gnomon. The obsidian pillar, the key point of the indigenous route, now stood as our final obstacle. Look at the pillar, Elias, Voss whispered, his eyes suddenly clear. It's not just a marker, it's a defensive emplacement. The third agent is in the small, narrow crevice on the western side. They want you to walk right into his line of fire once you cross the physical line of the divide. My stomach churned. The precision of the cartel was breathtaking. They had used the pass as natural shelter, the very thing that defined the passage as the perfect ambush point. I stared at Van Houten, who was now signaling for us to move, his hands casually folded behind his back. He knew. He was watching me walk into my death. I glanced at the rolled Terra Incognita map still resting on the ledge. I knew what I had to do. Jacob, I need you to shoot that map. Not the men, the map. Voss, though bewildered, nodded once. He understood the language of destruction. I pulled the obsidian plate from my satchel, holding the magnificent, dangerous object high above my head, flashing the black etched lines in the fading sunlight. Mr. Van Houten, I shouted, your exchange is rejected. I know your true secret, and I know your trap. I threw the obsidian plate not at Van Houten, but against the exposed face of the obsidian pillar. The polished volcanic glass shattered with a loud, deafening crack against the gnomon, sending shards of the etched map flying across the pass. Van Houten's mask of composure instantly evaporated, replaced by raw, furious panic. No! He roared, dropping his calm facade completely. The knowledge! Secure the fragments! Kill the cartographer! His 2 guards immediately raised their pistols, but the moment the obsidian plate shattered, Voss fired first. Crack! Voss didn't aim for the guards. He shot the rolled terra incognita map on the ledge. The round ripped through the ancient leather and paper, sending the map fluttering and dissolving in the wind. The guards, momentarily confused by the blast and the destruction of the cartel's sacred geometry, hesitated. I used the precious second of confusion, shoving the wounded Voss onto Meridian. "Go! West! Down the pass!" Voss yelled in pain, but he held on. Meridian, terrified by the gunshot, bolted into the western descent, scrambling down the loose shale toward the distant valley. I was left alone. The two guards, now recovering, were leveling their pistols at me. Van Houten was screaming orders, his authority shattered by my act of deliberate destruction. I did the only thing a true cartographer could do when faced with inevitable defeat. I ran toward the trap. I sprinted toward the gnomon, drawing the guard's fire. Rounds whizzed by my ears, chipping stone behind me. I dove behind the massive obsidian pillar just as the third agent, emerging from his ambush position, opened fire. Trapped between the three guards and the concealed agent, my pistol was useless. My eyes, however, fixed on the small, hidden lock mechanism I had used to open the vault. The mechanism, Silas Crane's locket, was still engaged in the lock. With a final desperate strength, I twisted the locket counterclockwise. The gnomon, the massive obsidian pillar that served as the navigational anchor for the entire pass, was not set in bedrock. It was the lid to a supply shaft designed to be moved for maintenance and resupply. With a grinding, horrible shriek of stone against stone, the pillar began to pivot inward. The sudden movement, coupled with the echoing roar of the shifting rock, caused the hidden agent to lose his footing, screaming as he tumbled into the depths of the shaft. Van Houten and his two guards, scrambling to avoid the collapsing stone, were momentarily disoriented. I scrambled over the continental divide, jumping clear of the shifting obsidian. The path to the west was open. I didn't look back at the chaos I had unleashed. I ran down the western slope, following the sounds of Meridian's hooves, leaving behind the three enraged cartel agents, the shattered obsidian, and the smoking remains of the map that had begun my journey. The enemy's hour had ended, not in an exchange of goods, but in a chaotic exchange of violence and broken truths. I was now a man running not toward a discovery, but toward a final confrontation on the distant Pacific shore. My mission was no longer verification, it was exposure. The descent from the Obsidian Pass was not a journey, it was a punishment. We scrambled down the western slopes of the Rockies, guided only by the desperate need to put maximum distance between ourselves and the enraged cartel agents we had left at the Continental Divide. The immense, unforgiving wilderness of the western slope felt like a sheer drop into another reality. Voss was in agony. The chaotic, jolting ride exacerbated his shoulder wound, and his face was drawn taut with fever and exhaustion. I stopped every few hours to change his bloodied bandage and forced the last of the medicinal tonic down his throat. He spoke only in short, clicked phrases. "Keep Meridian moving, Elias. They won't follow the immediate line of retreat. They'll cut the lower trails." He was a prophet of the frontier. I navigated not by the stars, but by the cartel's presumed strategy, constantly moving laterally to avoid their wider sweep. We rode for 2 days straight, the landscape transforming from jagged rock to rolling, pine-covered foothills, and finally to the thick, damp, temperate rainforests that began to hint at the nearby ocean. The air began to carry the clean, metallic scent of salt and iodine.
My mind, however, was focused not on the terrain, but on the artifacts in my satchel. The true cartel map, the obsidian plate, was shattered, its knowledge scattered across the high tundra. But I had secured the largest fragment, a jagged piece of the black glass that contained the detailed etching of the final destination, Portus Obscurus, the hidden port. In the relative safety of a mountain cave, I laid out the fragments of information, the obsidian shard, the final log of Silas Crane, and the ledger detailing the cartel's shipping schedules. I used my dividers to scale the map on the obsidian fragment, comparing its distinctive coastal contours to the vague, speculative British charts I carried. The port was located in a narrow, deep cove, perfectly sheltered from the open Pacific and entirely invisible from the sea lanes. It was a flawless deception, a geographic cul-de-sac. The sheer scale of the operation now hit me with devastating clarity. The folly was not a local mine. It was a complete, secure international supply chain, waiting only for America to expand enough to make its eastern entrance seem plausible. Our mission had changed. Destroying the map wasn't enough. I had to destroy the physical evidence of the port itself and secure proof that would force the Republic to acknowledge the full extent of the cartel's shadow empire. The hidden port. We reached the Pacific shore on the 5th day after leaving the pass. The contrast between the cold, dry air of the interior and the crashing, boundless gray majesty of the ocean was overwhelming. It was the endpoint of my journey, the final absolute border of the continent. Following the obsidian fragment, we found the hidden cove. It was breathtakingly deceptive. A dense curtain of ancient, massive cedar trees descended right to the waterline, concealing the deep, calm cove behind a thick, seemingly impenetrable wall of green. We left Meridian tethered deep in the forest and approached on foot. The sounds of the Pacific surf faded, replaced by the distinct industrial sounds of organized commerce, the rhythmic clack of heavy machinery, the creak of cables, and the muffled shouts of command. Peering through the final curtain of trees, the sight that greeted me was sickening in its efficiency. It was a modern, fully functioning port. A massive, deep-hulled Dutch trading vessel, an East Indiaman judging by its size, was moored to a substantial permanent pier. The dock itself was piled high with crates and, most disturbingly, long, dark copper ingots stamped with the very geometric cipher I had seen in the Kentucky mine. This was the King's Folly, refined and ready for shipment. Workers, not the native laborers from Fort Elamari, but rough white laborers, likely recruited from the international ports and bound by strict contract, were loading the copper. Overseers, armed with rifles, monitored the operation from elevated platforms. I felt a surge of rage that eclipsed my exhaustion. My scholarly quest for truth had led me here, to a place where international greed was literally shipping the wealth of the Republic out from underneath its feet. "Look at the main warehouse, Elias," Voss whispered, pointing to the largest building on the pier. "See the high brass dome? That's not for storage. That's their central communication." The fall of the copper compass. Voss was pointing to the apex of the central warehouse, where a dome of tarnished, heavy copper sat atop the roof. At its center, a complicated array of antennae and specialized lenses was mounted, rotating slowly. It was a communication system, likely a specialized form of heliograph or signaling apparatus designed to relay encrypted messages over long distances to vessels waiting offshore or to the Eastern Cartel network. That is the copper compass, I realized, naming the object in my mind. It was the nerve center of the cartel's entire operation, the navigational instrument that guaranteed the smooth, secret flow of wealth. If I could destroy that, the operation would fall deaf and blind. We formulated a plan of desperate simplicity. Voss, despite his pain, was the superior shot. He would use his long rifle to create a diversion, targeting the heavy cables used to hoist the cargo, forcing the armed overseers to focus on securing the freight. I, meanwhile, would utilize the confusion to infiltrate the warehouse and destroy the copper compass mechanism. We waited until midnight, when the Pacific fog rolled in, thick and cold, shrouding the cove in a dense, silent blanket. I slipped out first, moving low along the water's edge. The smell of oil and brine was sharp. I managed to reach the shadow of the main pier, slipping past a tired-looking guard and finding the service ladder that ran up the side of the warehouse. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous, smelling of raw copper dust and stale tobacco. I ascended the ladder to the upper communication room. The room was small and circular, dominated by the copper dome that covered the signaling apparatus.
A single technician, a thin, nervous man dressed in a Dutch naval jacket, sat hunched over a desk, checking instruments. He jumped when I burst through the hatch. "Stay where you are," I barked, my pistol shaking in my hand. "Don't move or speak." Before the technician could react, the outside chaos erupted. Voss fired his rifle. The sound, muffled by the fog, was immediately followed by a tremendous crack as a heavy cargo line snapped, sending a hoist full of copper ingots crashing onto the dock below. Shouts and confusion erupted outside. The technician, galvanized by the alarm, lunged for a small lever on the wall, the general alarm. I fired my pistol. The shot went wide, shattering a glass pane, but the sound of the blast deterred him. He froze, his face white with terror. I didn't waste time on him. I moved to the center of the room, standing directly beneath the massive copper compass dome. The mechanism was a beautiful, terrible piece of engineering, a massive, intricate brass rotor covered with fine copper wiring and lenses. It was the physical manifestation of the cartel's organized greed. I raised my pistol, but a bullet was too small. I needed brute force. I grabbed a nearby heavy brass lampstand and swung it with all my desperate strength I possessed, smashing it into the delicate copper rotors and lenses. The force of the impact was tremendous. Copper shrieked, glass exploded, and the mechanism buckled and seized. Sparks showered the room as the overloaded wire shorted out. The central intelligence of Portus Obscurus collapsed into a smoking ruin. Outside, the shouts intensified, but they were no longer shouts of command. They were shouts of confusion. The loss of the central communication crippled the cartel's organization. I didn't stop there. I grabbed the technician by the collar, dragging him to a shelf of communications logs. "Who are your ships, man? Where are they bound?" The Valkyrie, bound for Canton. They sail at dawn," he stammered, pointing to a ledger. I tore the relevant pages from the ledger, a final, crucial piece of evidence naming the cartel's vessels and their true international destinations. Just as I prepared to escape, the hatch below burst open. Dirk Van Houten, the cartel administrator I had faced at the pass, climbed into the room, his elegant coat torn, his face smeared with soot and rage. "Thorn, you mapmaker! You have ruined a century of work!" he snarled, raising his German pistol. "You have ruined the American West, Van Houten!" I shouted back. He fired. The bullet missed, burying itself into the wall beside me. I shoved the terrified technician into Van Houten's path and vaulted through the broken window, dropping 20 feet onto a pile of stacked lumber below.
I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs. But I was outside. I found Voss, who had been shot in the leg but was still firing, providing covering fire for the main forest line. "The compass is down, Jacob. We have the evidence. We move." We plunged back into the dark, damp forest, the sounds of the pursuit now fragmented and disorganized, just like the shattered copper compass. We did not stop to look back at the cove, now descending into a frantic chaos of disorganized guards and stranded ships. The fall of the copper compass was complete. The physical link between the cartel's shadow empire and the global trade network was severed. I had arrived on the Pacific as a fugitive, but I left it as a man with a singular, terrible truth. The Pacific coast, that final boundless edge of the continent, had been a battlefield. We left it with the stench of gunpowder and salt in our nostrils, the chaos of the ruined copper compass echoing in our ears. Our direction was now irrevocably east, a 1,000-mile reverse journey across the same treacherous, indifferent land, but this time the stakes were profoundly different. We were no longer seeking the truth. We were carrying it. Voss was in a bad state. The bullet wound in his leg, sustained during the exchange at Portus Obscurus, had slowed him to a painful crawl. We couldn't risk the high mountain passes again. The cartel would have secured those routes, anticipating our retreat. Our only chance was to move south along the coast for 50 miles and then attempt to pick up a minor, older Spanish mission trail that led toward the arid interior, a route that would be longer but far less patrolled. The first few weeks were hell. The dense, foggy coastal forests offered cover, but the terrain was a maze of thickets and fallen timber. I became the sole provider and nurse. I hunted small game, tended the horses, now reduced to Meridian, as Voss's mount had been lost in the final scramble, and meticulously cleaned and bandaged Voss's wound. My mind, the mind of a meticulous scholar, struggled with the constant brutal demands of survival, yet the physical labor was a strange necessary antidote to the intellectual trauma of Finch's betrayal. I found a new, quiet competence in the wilderness, learning to read the language of tracks and shadows instead of the language of Latin. Voss, humbled by his injury, became a quiet instructor. "You need to think like dust, Elias," he rasped one night, watching me clean my pistol. "You settle where you're least expected, and you cover your own tracks. The map is safe, but the man carrying it is the target." The satchel was my world now. Inside, I carried the most dangerous documents in the Republic: the shattered obsidian fragment, the final log of Silas Crane, the confession and the truth of the indigenous route, and the ledger pages, the names of the ships and the final destinations. I had wrapped them in oiled silt and sewn them into a hidden compartment in the lining of my coat. The trial of trust in the interior. As we turned inland, leaving the coastal moisture for the dry, endless heat of the interior canyons, the danger shifted from direct pursuit to quiet infiltration. The cartel was not just a shipping company, it was a vast intelligence network, operating through corrupted officials and greedy merchants. Our identity, Elias Crane, land speculator, was still our shield. We traded the copper ingots Voss had scavenged from Portus Obscurus for fresh supplies in small isolated trading posts. The gold was tangible proof of our alleged discovery, and the prospect of more copper was enough to blind the local traders to the deep scars on Voss's shoulder and leg. The journey through the Great Basin was a constant, shimmering mirage of doubt. Every face was a potential agent of Dirk van Houten. I began to look for the subtle cues from Finch's ledger: the men who invested in certain banks, the merchants who shipped only to New York, the sudden, suspicious interest in geology. One afternoon, in a dusty settlement in the Nevada Territory, I encountered a man whose familiarity was unnerving. He was a wealthy-looking man, dressed in quality Eastern cloth, claiming to be an engineer inspecting land for future railway access. His conversation was too precise, too eager to discuss longitudes and elevations. "You are a cartographer, Mr. Crane, a man of vision. Tell me, do you see any evidence of a viable western water passage? The government is quite fixated on the northern approach, but I believe the true wealth lies in the mid-continent." It was the classic cartel trap, using intellectual curiosity to fish for information. I met his gaze, adopting the persona of a greedy, disillusioned profiteer. "The only passage I've found, sir, is paved with the sweat of men who were promised gold and given only dirt. The mid-continent is a wasteland of broken dreams. I'm going back east to sell my steak before the fever breaks." I showed him the copper ingots, not the map. I appealed to his greed, not his intellect. He seemed satisfied with my avarice and moved on, but not before I saw a small silver ring on his finger, not the geometric cipher, but a simpler design, a rearing lion, subtly linking him to the Vanderhoof network. He hadn't sought to kill me, he sought to verify my resignation. The cartel wanted me to be a broken man, returning east to sell off worthless bad land. We rode away from that post within the hour, knowing that the engineer was already sending a coded dispatch to the east. Subject is disillusioned, threat neutralized. This deceptive silence was the dust that covered our tracks. The final approach tested the final line of my own meridian of trust, my loyalty to Voss. His leg wound began to bleed heavily again near the banks of the Arkansas River. He was suffering greatly, and our pace slowed to a dangerous crawl. "Leave me, Elias," Voss commanded one bitter morning, his voice weak. "The map is the thing. Take Meridian. Ride hard to the Mississippi. I will slow them down when they find me." The temptation was immense. I was exhausted, terrified, and so close to the civilized East. To abandon Voss, the man who had risked his life at Portus Obscurus and covered my escape at Fort El Amari, would be pragmatic.
It was what Finch would have advised. But Finch was the exemplar of quiet betrayal. Voss, the greedy mercenary, had been the example of hard-won, conditional trust. "I won't leave you, Jacob," I replied, hoisting him back onto Meridian. "We made a bargain. We ride until we reach the point where the law can protect us both. If you are caught, the cartel will silence you and deny the existence of the mine. We need your testimony." We pushed on, using the broad, predictable track of the Santa Fe Trail to make up speed, gambling that the cartel would look for us in the deep wilderness, not on the main road. The dust of the trail, the endless cloud raised by our horse, symbolized the anonymity we desperately needed. Finally, we reached the Mississippi. The great river, the gateway to the west, now felt like the threshold of salvation. We hired a large river barge bound for Cincinnati. Voss was concealed beneath a stack of crates, his wound finally stable. As the barge churned north, the familiar, comforting sight of organized American settlements began to appear on the banks. I knew that soon I would be back in the world of law, government, and the civilized debate I had once cherished. I sat on the deck, feeling the familiar rhythmic pull of the river. I pulled the obsidian shard from my coat lining, holding the cold, etched stone in my hand. It was no longer a fragment of an illegal map. It was a physical artifact of a great historical crime, ready to be presented as evidence. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the sheltered academic, or Elias Crane, the fraudulent speculator. I was the keeper of a terrible, vital truth. The journey home was nearly complete, but the most dangerous part, convincing the new young republic that its celebrated expansion was built over a dangerous, organized lie, was about to begin. The dust of the long road home was settling, but the fire it held was about to ignite. The slow, rhythmic pulse of the river barge carrying us north on the Mississippi felt like the heartbeat of a world I no longer belonged to. The dust of the frontier had been washed away, replaced by the choking humidity of the settled east. But the physical grime had merely concealed a deeper, more profound contamination. I had traveled a continent to expose a political cancer, and now I was delivering the specimen back to the very body it was killing.
Jacob Voss lay beneath a mound of empty crates, his fever finally broken, but his strength utterly spent. We reached Cincinnati and exchanged the last of the cartel's copper ingots for legitimate paper currency, a move that felt like trading true power for worthless tokens. I secured Voss passage on a northbound wagon train toward New York, ensuring he was far from Washington, D.C. until the fire I was about to light had burned itself out. "The 1/3 stake, Elias," Voss whispered, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't forget the bargain." "I won't forget the bargain, Jacob," I assured him, securing a small bag of silver to his belt. "You'll have your gold when the Republic claims the mine. Until then, stay alive." I left him there, a wounded frontiersman, disappearing into the noise of commerce, the one man whose conditional loyalty I now trusted more than any oath sworn in the capital. I continued alone, taking the public stagecoach toward the new capital, Washington, D.C. The city was a work in progress, a raw, muddy testament to ambitious, sometimes clumsy governance. The streets were broad, the structures imposing, but the entire place felt like a grand blueprint that had yet to take root. I arrived not as Elias Thorne, the former chief draftsman, but as Elias Crane, a geologist from the West with a sensitive matter for the Secretary of State. My initial attempt to gain an audience with James Madison, the Secretary of State, was met with the expected bureaucratic indifference. I was shuffled from department to department, my urgent pleas for national security dismissed by young, bored aides who eyed my worn leather coat and dust-stained boots with professional disdain. The evidence, the obsidian shard, Crane's final log, and the ledger pages, remained hidden in the lining of my coat, priceless truths guarded by impenetrable walls of polite refusal. "The Secretary is busy with negotiations over the Chesapeake," one aide sniffed. "He does not meet with land speculators peddling fairy tales of secret passages." I realized then that the cartel's defense in the East was infinitely more sophisticated than their stone blockhouses in the West. It was plausible deniability, buttressed by the sheer inconvenience of believing me. The government wanted the Louisiana Purchase to be a success story, not a massive fraud built over foreign military infrastructure. The architect of silence. My entire strategy shifted. I stopped seeking an audience and started seeking the cartel. I rented a small, nondescript room in a quiet boarding house far from Capitol Hill. I pulled out the most devastating document in my possession, Professor Finch's Ledger of Eastern Acquisitions. The ledger, which detailed the cartel's intelligence and financial networks, listed a select few agents in the capital. The most alarming entry was labeled the Eastern Sentinel. The entry for the Sentinel was sparse, listing only an initial and a title, G.H., Treasury Analyst, New Department of Western Commerce. I spent 2 days utilizing my old academic connections, subtle inquiries, misplaced documents, discreet requests for background information on the fledgling government departments. The name I uncovered was George Harding, a seemingly innocuous, brilliant young analyst who had been instrumental in the financial valuation of the Louisiana Purchase. He was Madison's trusted advisor on all matters pertaining to the new Western territories. The truth hit me with the force of the Obsidian Pass wind. George Harding was the cartel's highest functioning agent in the capital. He hadn't just valued the purchase, he had ensured the official maps were kept vague, the French surveys accepted without question, and the financial structure was in place to profit from the cartel's shadow operations. He was the architect of the government's convenient ignorance. I could not simply expose Harding. I needed leverage that would destroy him and force the government's hand without collapsing the credibility of the entire Jefferson administration. I chose a dramatic, high-stakes moment for the confrontation. The weekly public reception, hosted by Secretary Madison, a night where political rivals and foreign dignitaries mingled openly. I stood near the door, waiting. When Harding walked past, I moved directly into his path, my hand sliding inside my coat, not to draw a weapon, but to touch the silk-wrapped ledger pages. "Good evening, Mr. Harding," I said, using my former name, Elias Thorne. Harding froze. His sophisticated, practiced expression dissolved into a moment of pure, panicked recognition. He didn't know how I was alive, but he knew exactly who I was. "Thorne," he hissed, pulling me into the shadow of a decorative column. "I understood the matter was neutralized. Finch assured us you were broken." "Finch was a traitor who served a network of traitors, Harding. I have seen the folly. I have seen the mine, the pass, and the port, and I have Finch's ledger detailing your financial arrangements with Dirk Van Huyten." Harding recovered quickly, his eyes glittering with cold calculation. "You have a tale, Thorne, a very entertaining tale. But your evidence is the word of a fugitive academic and a dead, delirious surveyor. No jury will believe you." This was the core of the problem. My truth was too wild, too comprehensive for the polite, ordered world of D.C. "You're wrong, Harding," I countered, leaning in close. "I don't need a jury. I need a single newspaper headline in London. I have the ledger pages showing the Valkyrie shipping refined copper to Canton on the day your purchase valuation was approved. I have the indigenous star chart, the Obsidian, which proves your cartel is exploiting an ancient native passage, a direct violation of every treaty signed with the Western tribes. I played my final reckless hand. International threat. Harding's face went ash gray. He didn't fear America, he feared the British Navy disrupting the cartel's global trade monopoly. "What is your demand, Thorne?" he whispered, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "I demand the truth be addressed, Harding," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "You will arrange an immediate, private meeting for me with President Jefferson. I will present the evidence. The U.S. government must launch an immediate, secret military expedition to occupy and dismantle Portus Obscurus before the next shipping window." The silence of the Republic. The meeting was arranged for the following morning, a tense, high-stakes affair held in a quiet, book-lined room away from the Capitol. Present were President Jefferson, Secretary Madison, and the nervous, sweating George Harding, who was introduced as the expert on Western land valuations. I laid out the evidence, the shattered obsidian fragment, the detailed log of Silas Crane's confession, and the cartel's financial ledger pages. I told them the entire story. The King's Folly, the hydrological switch, the enslaved labor, the Gromon, and the existence of a permanent, high-capacity, unmonitored Pacific port. Jefferson and Madison listened in stunned, profound silence. When I finished, the silence stretched, thick and painful, broken only by the scratching of Harding's pen. Finally, President Jefferson spoke, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Thorne, this is the most profound political and geographical claim ever presented to this office. If true, it means the very foundations of our expansion are built on a bedrock of organized treason." Madison, the pragmatist, immediately addressed the solution. "Mr. Thorne, we cannot under any circumstances admit this. To expose the truth now is to admit that the French defrauded us, that our intelligence failed, and that a foreign entity has an active military base on sovereign soil. It risks civil war with the Western states and invites an immediate British incursion."
Harding stepped in, smooth and calculating. "There is only one solution, Mr. President. We must neutralize the evidence without validating the claimant. We launch a secret, high-speed military survey. We will not call it a removal operation. We will call it an extension of the Lewis and Clark expedition, tasked with verifying vague sightings of a deep Pacific harbor. That expedition will dismantle the port, occupy the mine, and secure the cartel's assets, all without acknowledging Mr. Thorne's existence." It was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly political. The truth would be swallowed by official procedure. I would be silenced, the cartel defeated, but the government's reputation preserved. Jefferson turned to me. "Your bravery, Mr. Thorne, has saved this republic a civil war, but you must disappear. You will receive an official, non-traceable stipend. You'll be assigned a permanent, quiet post in the capital, a sinecure in the National Archives, specializing in colonial records. You will have access to any book you desire, but you will never again publish a single word concerning the West. You will adopt a new identity, and you will never speak of this again. You will live a quiet life in the capital city under the direct, unblinking eye of this office." I understood the choice. Accept the silence, save the republic from collapse, and ensure the cartel's physical infrastructure was destroyed. Or rage against the machine, publish the truth, and risk a war I couldn't survive. I nodded. "I accept. But I have two conditions, Mr. President. First, the 2 captured American spies must be located and compensated. Second, Jacob Voss, my partner, must be granted a full, legitimate land grant in the territory the cartel called the Folly." Jefferson agreed immediately. The debt of the Republic would be paid, but in the currency of silence. The new meridian. I became Elias Vance, a meticulous, quiet archivist, a man of profound stillness in the chaotic energy of Washington, D.C. My life was rebuilt on the foundation of a lie, but it was a quiet life, a secure life, one earned by traversing a continent of danger. My office was small, filled with the comforting scent of old paper and dust. I spent my days meticulously cataloging the historical documents that were allowed to exist, a living ghost in the National Archives. But my quiet life was not alone. Jacob Voss, now fully recovered and a quiet, wealthy landholder in Kentucky, would visit D.C. twice a year, delivering fine Kentucky whiskey and checking on his investment. He had his gold, his land, and his silence. I often sat late at night in the quiet solitude of the archives, my hand tracing the lines on the obsidian shard, the physical proof of the truth that was now buried deeper than any secret vault. The price of saving the Republic was the loss of my own name and the public record of my journey.
But every time I saw the vague, inaccurate official maps of the West, the maps that still showed the passage as a distant Arctic myth, I knew I had won the war. My true meridian was no longer an abstract line on a map, nor was it defined by the betrayal of a mentor. It was the quiet, shared vigilance between myself and Voss, two silent custodians of a dangerous truth, living our quiet lives in the capital city, waiting for the day the shadow of the cartographer's folly finally lifted. The year is 1823. 2 decades have passed since I, Elias Thorne, vanished into the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C., and emerged as Elias Vance, the quiet, indispensable archivist. I am now 50 years old, my hands no longer calloused by the rough terrain of the frontier, but smooth and stained perpetually with the dust of centuries-old parchment. I live my quiet life exactly as President Jefferson mandated, within the comforting silence of the National Archives, surrounded by the historical documents that were allowed to exist. The world outside my window had moved on, eagerly adopting the official narrative of American expansion. The Louisiana Purchase was celebrated as a peaceful, diplomatic triumph, a smooth canvas of opportunity. The Lewis and Clark expedition returned, filling the nation's atlases with new river names and mountain ranges. Their maps were hailed as the definitive truth of the West. Yet I knew the permanent, corrosive lie embedded in every crisp new line. My sinecure in the archives was a gilded cage, but it had a unique benefit. I was the keeper of the sealed, classified correspondence between the War Department and the White House. I knew exactly what the government had found when they followed my fragmented truth. The secret military survey, the extended mission that followed my exposure, was a brutal, surgical success. They found Fort El Amory and the vast illegal copper mine, which the official records later described as an abandoned Spanish exploratory station. They found the hydrological switch, which was quietly dismantled and repurposed for legitimate irrigation. They found the obsidian tass, its massive gnomon now lying shattered and partially buried, officially listed as a natural geological phenomenon. And they found Portus Obscurus, the hidden port. The report, locked in a single iron box in the most secure vault, stated that the port facility and the Dutch vessel, the Valkyrie, were scuttled and burned. The site was permanently decommissioned. The cartel's global operation, built on a century of silence, had been dismantled in less than a month by the quiet, overwhelming force of the nascent American military. Dirk Van Houten and his Eastern Sentinel, George Harding, simply vanished from the public record, the victims of a sudden, fatal case of political obscurity. Voss, true to the president's word, received his compensation. He now sends me thick, sprawling letters from his sprawling Kentucky homestead, often detailing his success in raising fine horses, never mentioning the cartel, the copper, or the passage. His letters are my only link to the man who saved my life, the only living testament to the truth. His silence is the measure of his wealth. The true map's influence. The most profound, lasting consequence of my journey is not found in the official narrative, but in the subtle, permanent mark left on the geography of the West. I often study the new government maps, the beautiful, authoritative charts produced after Lewis and Clark. They are magnificent, yet I know where to look for the scars of the conspiracy. The cartographers of the time, faced with the need to smooth over the geographical anomalies I had exposed, subtly altered the published lines. The rivers near the old hydrological switch are consistently mapped as flowing unusually fast or prone to unexpected seasonal shifts, obscuring the fact that the flow was once entirely artificial. The region near the old copper mine is still labeled as having unpromising geological potential, a lie designed to deter further prospectors. But the permanent mark is clearest on the west coast. While Portus Obscurus was destroyed, the naval officers who led the secret mission recognized the strategic value of the cove. Years later, when the U.S. began to seriously consider its Pacific presence, they chose to establish a military outpost and depot precisely 5 miles south of the cartel's old cove. The official reason given was favorable wind currents. The true reason? The cove's unique natural shelter, first mapped by Silas Crane and perfected by the cartel, was simply too valuable to abandon entirely. The ghost of Portus Obscurus still haunts the Pacific coast, now flying the American flag, a constant reminder that the Republic's destiny was partly decided by the secretive ingenuity of its enemies. I am often asked what I do in the archives. My official title is Cataloger of Colonial Records, but my true function is far more vital. I am the custodian of the Great Lie. I ensure that the records of the cartel, Professor Finch's treachery, and the Obsidian Pass remain locked away, not to protect the cartel, but to protect the Republic from the political devastation that public knowledge would bring. I walk through the marble halls of the Capitol, a quiet man in a dark coat, and I look at the grand maps of the West, all those crisp, confident lines, and I smile faintly. The lines are beautiful, and they are lies. My life is quiet. I have my books, my solitude, and my memories of the relentless plains, the icy pass, and the smell of salt and copper. My journey began with the simple scholarly pursuit of a line on a map. It ended with the profound realization that a nation's history is not defined by the truths it publishes, but by the vital, dangerous lies it chooses to bury. I am Elias Vance. I drew the final, most important map, the secret one, and I carry it in my memory. And in the heart of the capital city, I have found my own permanent, unassailable peace.